We've got a 5-year-old child with a lot of antibody, let's say 90%, whose transplant is failing. What are you going to do, Sam?
I'd enroll them in the National Living Kidney Donor Sharing Scheme.
A sharing scheme. In Holland, child with about 90% antibodies, failing transplant.
I can't answer that question. You have to ask our doctors. Sorry.
Okay. Nick? Don't say phone me. Okay. So that's really the starting point for this talk. If we look at this data from the States, basically, if you look at this line here, you can see that over the years up to 2012, the number of transplants in children has gone up. And that's been particularly true with those who don't have much antibody. But those who have a lot of antibody, nothing much has changed. So this is a problem. The first thing I think we should do if we've got someone with a lot of antibody is start looking for donors early. And I think something that sometimes happens is that we're a bit slow with children in finding a living donor because, well, they're not going to wait that long on the list. So maybe if they have to wait a little bit longer for a donor and then get them onto the list, so be it. But actually, I think you should be looking for a donor early so that if that original living donor can't proceed for any reason, you get an alternative donor and you've got something in place. And then the next thing you should do is try and decide what is the chance of a transplant. And in the UK, we have this transplant calculator, which you can go online. Anyone can use it. And you fill in various factors. The CRF, for those of you who don't know, is the calculated reaction frequency, and that's the percentage of the last 10,000 deceased donors against whom the child has HLA antibodies and therefore will not get offered an organ. So if your CRF is 100%, you weren't going to get any of the last 10,000 deceased donors. Okay. So you put these factors in: matchability moderate, sensitization 85 to 100% CRF. Let's say they're HLA homozygous, let's say they're non-white, and let's say they're 5 years old. Chance of a transplant at 2 years is 10%. Okay? So when we think, yeah, children get an offer relatively quickly, that's not the case for these children. One of the other things that I think you need to think about is what are you doing with the immunosuppression? So one thing that we see is transplant is failing, fails completely, they go on to dialysis, the immunosuppression is stopped, they're left on a little bit of steroids, and then this happens. The antibodies go up. And this is the CRF here. So the antibody in this child went up to 100%. Okay? We restarted. Luckily, our lab noticed this and said, yeah, actually, something's going on here. And we restarted the immunosuppression, and the antibodies came down. So they may not need full immunosuppression that they would have for a functional transplant, but actually keeping a bit of tacrolimus or MMF going. If their antibodies are around 80%, 70%, can make a huge difference. And there's a big difference, as I'm going to show you, between having 70 to 80% level of antibody and 90%. So I'm going to consider this in two sections. One is if there is a living donor, and the second is if there is not a living donor. So if there is a living donor, child has antibody, and the cross-match is negative, we would suggest just do the transplant. Okay, we don't think that's a problem. So if there is third-party antibody, so HLA antibody but not against the donor, we just do the transplant. If there is donor-specific antibody, we'd think about using alemtuzumab for induction. But we're not particularly worried about those. We would get on and do it. If we have a living donor and the cross-match is positive, as Sam says, the first place to go is the kidney sharing scheme. More and more children are going into that, and the success in adults of the kidney sharing scheme at the moment is very high, partly because of novel strategies and partly because of increased numbers. And you can use another calculator, also on the ODT website, to calculate the chances in the kidney sharing scheme. So let's say this child is blood group B, 95 to 100% calculated reaction frequency with a blood group B donor, and the recipient age, they don't have a pediatric one for this, so I've put 18 to 30. The chance in the kidney sharing scheme, less than 10%. Okay, so your chances in the scheme will vary just as your chances on the deceased donor list will vary. And what's quite important is to pick out those who are going to have a high chance from these strategies and those who are going to have a low chance. If they've got a low chance, start thinking about alternative strategies. And if you look at, and most of what I'm going to show you is adult data because we don't have enough children who are involved in these things. If you look at adult data in the kidney sharing scheme, if your CRF is 95 to 100%, your chance of getting transplanted is 15%, compared with 50% nearly if it's anything less than that. So there is a tipping point when you get to a very high level of antibody when your chance of a deceased donor or a sharing scheme donor becomes pretty small. And that has implications for how long you leave people in the scheme for. The blood group of your donor and recipient is also important. So if you go into the sharing scheme and you are blood group A into B, again, you've got about a 50% chance of getting a match. But if you're A into O, that's 25%. Okay, and that's without even thinking about antibodies. So the blood group, about HLA antibodies. So the blood group combination is really critical. And I said don't leave people in the sharing scheme forever. This graph shows your chance of getting transplanted by the number of runs. So in the UK, every 3 months there'll be a run of the sharing scheme. Okay? So the first time it happens, you've got 15% chance of getting transplanted. The next time another 7% and so on. But what you can appreciate is as you get out to 6 or 7, your incremental chance of getting transplanted if you haven't been transplanted by this stage is relatively low. If you're going to get a match, it's going to be here. So typically what we say to our antibody incompatible pairs is, after a year, if you haven't had a transplant, we need to start thinking about alternative strategies. And here are some of them. So you can be in the kidney sharing scheme, but you can also be in the kidney sharing scheme and you can accept a blood group incompatible transplant. So if you have HLA incompatibility, and for that reason you go into the sharing scheme, you can say, I won't take an HLA incompatible transplant, but I will take an ABO incompatible transplant. And indeed, in the most recent run of the UK kidney sharing scheme, 9 of the 286 recipients who were in the scheme were listed for a blood group incompatible transplant within the scheme. So they would accept an incompatible donor. We've done a little bit of work on this here, and we've translated that into some modeling with NHS Blood and Transplant. So if you look at blood group B patients, and you look at whether how many of this is adult patients, how many of them have low titers, by which we mean 1 in 16 or lower, low titer of anti-A, it's over half of them. So blood group B, difficult to transplant. We can expect that adults will have a low titer of anti-A and therefore a high chance of accepting an A into B incompatible transplant with relative ease. And as I'm going to show you in a minute, for children, we would expect that to be even higher. And when we model that in the sharing scheme, interestingly, what we find, so this row here is the actual matching run, most recent one in October, which identifies 85 potential transplants. If we put this data in, say, well, all of those could have a low titer blood group incompatible, we end up with 120 transplants. So that's quite a significant change. Now, clearly not all of them would be suitable for that, but it's certainly an option to think about. And one key message that is important to take away is blood group incompatible and HLA incompatible transplants are not the same in terms of risk. So graft survival for blood group incompatible is generally speaking comparable to compatible transplants, give or take 1 or 2%. For HLA incompatibles, we get the chronic attrition, which we think is due to chronic antibody-mediated rejection, as well as some early graft loss due to perioperative issues. This paper by the good Dr. Stojanovic shows that we can transplant children across blood group incompatibilities, and we've done 11 between the two centres here successfully, with comparable results to compatibles. So are you better with a living donor, blood group incompatible, or a deceased donor, compatible? Okay, so this is similar to Chris's point about are you better with a poorly matched living donor or a well-matched deceased donor? So this is some work that Pankaj has been doing. I hope he's going to finish it before Christmas. But the early data, this is registry data, and the blue line here is the blood group incompatible living donor. The red is the blood group compatible deceased donor. And it looks as though the graft survival is broadly similar, but interestingly, the patient survival seems to be better for the blood group incompatible living donor. So that it's early data, we need to work on the matching and look at the matching of the two groups in a bit more detail. But the suggestion from that is that you're better off with a blood group incompatible living donor than a compatible deceased donor, than waiting for a compatible deceased donor. So you could just go into the sharing scheme. You can go into the sharing scheme and accept a blood group incompatible. You could go into the sharing scheme and accept an HLA incompatible. So you could exchange a high-risk HLA incompatible transplant from the direct donor. You'd exchange that for a low-risk one within the sharing scheme. So how would we do that? Well, there's two ways of doing it. So this is the printout that we get from the lab of HLA antibodies. And these are, each of these different antigens or different antibodies and the level of antibody. And you could look at that and you could say, okay, let's take all of these here, low-level antibodies, and let's just ignore them. Let's just say they're probably not going to cause a problem, and we remove those from the listing on the computer, therefore we call it delisting. We accept a potential organ within the sharing scheme, and then we do a cross-match, and if that's negative, then we go ahead and do the transplant. Okay. The problem with that is it's not easy to predict whether a cross-match is going to be positive or negative for a given level of antibody. Generally speaking, if you've got extremely high levels of donor-specific antibody, by which I mean 60, 70, 80,000 MFI, you would expect the cross-match to be positive. But if you try and predict from your antibody whether or not you're going to have a positive or negative cross-match, it's difficult to do. And that's an important fact to keep in mind, because actually through our allocation system, we're working on the premise that we can predict it. So anyone with any donor-specific antibody, adult or child, never gets offered an organ to which they have antibody on that basis. So the other way to do it, the way we do it here, is to do what we call a test DFPP, double filtration plasmapheresis. And so we have the antibody profile before, we have the antibody profile after. So we know with one session of DFPP, this is what we can do to the antibody. And therefore, we look at the antibody that disappears or becomes a very low level, and we say, remove those antibodies from the listing, accept the kidney through the sharing scheme. If the cross-match is positive, then we remove the antibody with one session of DFPP prior to the transplant and use alemtuzumab induction. And the cross-match may well be negative. So here's an example. And what you can, if you just look at the turquoisey line. So we did the test here. We did the transplant here with a further desensitization, a further DFPP just before the transplant. And the patient did fine. Antibody went slowly up afterwards, but they didn't have any graft dysfunction. So that was through the kidney sharing scheme. So the next option is to say, okay, well, we've tried accepting all of those options, but they still haven't got anything. We're going to do a direct antibody incompatible. By that we mean not donor-specific antibody positive, but cross-match positive. And again, we might want to do a test DFPP to plan our antibody removal, and the lab will say to us, okay, the antibody's not moved at all, you're never going to get rid of this antibody, you can't do a direct. Or they're going to say, it's going to take 3 sessions over 3 days. So this is our algorithm, and I won't, in the interest of time, I won't go into that in too much detail. We've done about 60 adults this way, and we've done 3 children, and I think this is probably the first report worldwide. And there were various reasons why we had to do these particular children. But it's induction with alemtuzumab. We used ATG, I think, the first time around, and some IVIG the day before. And this is one child, so you can see a reasonable level of antibody, positive cross-match. Previous transplant had been lost, and CRF was 99%. They tried the sharing scheme. And we found that when we did the test, we could remove the antibody quite quickly. So we did the direct transplant, removed the antibody, and you can see here, plasma creatinine comes down, stays down. Interestingly, the donor-specific antibody goes up post-operatively, but there's no dysfunction, and the child did fine. But we do know that direct HLA incompatible transplants will have worse outcomes, as I've shown you before, because of chronic antibody-mediated rejection. So that's important to keep in mind. But it's also important to keep in mind what Chris told you this morning, which is the relative risk of staying on dialysis compared with transplantation. And we're not comparing HLA incompatibles versus compatibles, because there's no compatible option available for these children. So we're comparing having an HLA incompatible with staying on dialysis. And this is a paper from Doris Segev's group, and these two graphs here are the important ones. And they suggested that in the States, if you had antibody removal in order to have a direct HLA incompatible transplant, your survival was better than waiting on dialysis for a compatible transplant to come along. But that was from America, and things are different in America, so we repeated this using UK data. And actually we found no difference in survival in the UK. And that may be because we have better outcomes on dialysis than they do in the States. So at the moment, the data would suggest that it's about quality of life rather than quantity of life, as far as we know. This is for adults, okay? So there's no data on children at all. And I would expect that the advantages for children would probably be more in favor of direct transplant. So that's if you've got a living donor. If you've got no living donor, you can just leave them on the list and say, well, it's just tough, and wait till they get to 18 and then give them to somebody else. Or you can do the delisting that I've talked about, but do it for a deceased donor. Okay, so you can either just look at the antibody profile, or you can do your test and say, let's remove these listings from the national computer and accept a deceased donor kidney with these antigens. And in that case, you've then got the chance only to do one single DFPP immediately prior to transplant. And we've done this. Here's another example. If you just look at the yellow line, done this here and successfully transplanted them. And we've had mixed results. And at the moment in adults, our program is on hold because we've had 2 people who've died. But here's an example of someone with some success. So this was a 40-year-old who came to us saying he wanted to withdraw from dialysis. He'd been on dialysis for all of his adult life, but had a transplant as a child, became non-compliant in his teenage years, lost the transplant, highly sensitized, stayed on dialysis in another center. He said, I've had enough. I just want to ask you if you can do anything before I come off dialysis and die. So he got an altruistic donor. Despite the antibody, we managed to remove some antibody and give him the kidney. And the graft lasted 4 years. And most of you as clinicians would say, well, what a waste of a good kidney, terrible. And I've actually asked him in the clinic, was it worth it? He said, well, I started work. I moved out of my parents' house, been living there all my life. I got 2 girlfriends at the same time. And he thought his life had changed dramatically, and he was now preparing to go back on dialysis as a person with some hope and some means of getting through the next 5 to 10 years. So we can do a deceased donor blood group incompatible transplant. Okay, so if we've got this blood group B patient who's having some difficulty and they've got low titers, they could have an A kidney. And if the titers are low enough, they don't need any antibody removal. They don't need any additional treatment. And again, we've done this work, as I said earlier, and modeled it with NHSBT. And if you accept your titer cutoff as 1 in 8 for needing any antibody removal, you actually find a significant proportion of children on the waiting list have low titers, because children have lower titers than adults. So if you have your blood group B highly sensitized patient on the waiting list with no living donor, measure their anti-A titers and think about listing them for an A kidney. And you may also think about A2 donors. So blood group A is divided into A1 and A2, generally speaking. A2, the antigenicity is less because of the type of antigen and the expression of that antigen. And in the US, they've incorporated this formally into their allocation scheme. So they subtype their donors so that they know whether the deceased donor is A1 or A2. Recipients have titer levels measured every 3 months. And if they have low titers, so 1 in 8 or less, they'll put an A2 kidney into a B recipient, again, without anything, without any antibody removal or any additional therapy. And we've just had this approved at the Kidney Advisory Group in the UK, and the plan is to implement this over the next year or so in the UK. And these are some of the outcomes. So the most recent paper from the States, 560 patients, no difference in graft survival. And lastly, the other thing that you can do is you can reduce the antibody in your deceased donor recipient. There are a number of ways you can do this. So Nigel mentioned this, I think. Rituximab and IVIG, which is the cedar-cyanide protocol. Since that New England Journal paper, not many people have really been advocating this. We've tried it with some success in one patient, but the antibody didn't stay down long enough for us to get a deceased donor. And that's the problem. IDES or IDES, whichever way you want to say it. So this is a new drug. Comes from Streptococcus, and essentially it just mashes up your antibody, and it does it very, very quickly. So the initial data looks incredibly impressive. Within a matter of a few hours, your IgG goes shooting down. And this is now going into clinical trials. We're expecting the trial protocol to come out very soon. The trial is probably going to use it for treatment of antibody-mediated rejection. But what we're thinking about is using it to remove some antibody in order to allow deceased donor transplantation. It's a temporary thing, but nevertheless, it can be something that's useful. Eculizumab, so your C5 inhibitor, and there was a study which was completed some time ago, and the paper is currently with AJT, just undergoing revision. But it enrolled 80 patients, deceased donor patients, these are adults again, either DSA or cross-match positive, and they were given prophylactic eculizumab for 9 weeks with an outcome of, a composite outcome of antibody-mediated rejection, graft loss or death of 9%. The argument being that that 9% is much, much lower than we would expect. We would expect probably 45% for that outcome in that group. Unfortunately, the trial was very poorly designed, and therefore it's unlikely that the authorities are going to approve it for regular use. But we put 5 people into that trial, and just to show you some of the lengths of time that they've been waiting. Okay, so this is months, not weeks. 25 months, 80 months, and so on. And they got a transplant, and they're doing pretty well afterwards. So the only thing that's stopping us doing that now routinely is cost. So for your child who's highly sensitized, if you can't think of anything else to do, think about taking a kidney that they've got some antibody to and giving them some eculizumab prophylactic. So to finish off, I think there are many options for a highly sensitized child. I haven't mentioned the combined liver kidney because Nigel touched on it. That's another option as well. But I think the important thing is don't leave them without a transplant because we know they're going to do